Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley coming to you from Washington, D.C. The world economic and financial depression rolls on and on. The breakdown crisis of the existing world order has now reached a point of inflection, a moment of disintegration. We might call it the end of the globalized financial system, 1990 to 2010. This is not Bretton Woods anymore. Don't believe these commentators who say this is now the demise of Bretton Woods 1944. That happened 40 years ago on August 15th, 1971. This is now the specific casino economy, hot money, primacy of speculation, race to the bottom, deindustrialization, deregulation, privatization, Washington consensus. This has now obviously entered into crisis. The inflection point where all this becomes visible, Seoul, South Korea, the site of this year's G20 conference of heads of state, of heads of government, and the specific form it takes, a debacle for Obama. Obama reviled essentially on the world stage. The New York Times, putting it euphemistically, Obama economic line rejected on world stage. Yes, indeed. Obama's economic line is rejected on the world stage. This is, of course, the economic line of the U.S.-UK ruling class, going all the way from Soros to Peter Peterson, the austerity ghoul, all the way out to Rupert Murdoch, George Shultz, the Koch brothers, and the rest of the Wall Street community and their assorted hangers-on. United States, as predicted already here last week, United States completely isolated in Korea, except for an op-ed that Geithner was able to send into the Wall Street Journal, co-signed by the Australian finance minister and the Singapore foreign minister. That was all the cover the U.S. could get, because they're at odds even with the British over this austerity program. In other words, the idea that the U.S. wants others to be a locomotive to prop up the dollar, weaken your own currency to prop up the dollar. So the thing that has set this off is obviously, in general, the world economic and financial depression itself. But now we've had a year of beggar my neighbor. Remember, the big economic event of this past year from November to November was, of course, the U.S. orchestrated attack on Greece, Spain, Portugal, the euro, the crisis that reached its peak back in the month of May. So there's a lot of resentment. And we know now that in that month of May, Germany implemented bans on naked credit default swaps, and South Korea imposed limitations on the use of derivatives in June. We're still trying to get more about those. But the thing that has set off the wave of indignation is, of course, the maneuvering of helicopter Ben Bernanke and the illegal, unconstitutional, unelected, unaccountable Federal Reserve, that entity which ought to be nationalized, immediately seized and put back into the U.S. Treasury where it belongs, a bankers' insurrection lasting for 100 years. And we have a whole series of attacks on helicopter Ben Bernanke, specifically for his QE2, quantitative easing 2, the printing of dollars, the flooding of the U.S. system with liquidity, as they like to say, the massive injection of liquidity, and, of course, lots and lots of critiques. The most interesting comes from a friend that we've gotten to know over this past year, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, who accuses the United States of being a currency manipulator. The entire U.S. strategy going into Seoul and the G20 was to try to orchestrate a worldwide lynch mob against China, saying, you are currency manipulators, you are evil, you have got to be condemned, right? You're going to lose face and all the rest of it. Well, no, that didn't work because, among other things, the German finance minister came out and pointed out very clearly that the United States is guilty massively of precisely what they claim that China has been doing. And you've got a chorus, which includes such figures as Dilma, the new president of Brazil, with all of her left and probably ultra-left credentials. She's not happy with this. We've got Medvedev of Russia, says that if the United States wants to do these kinds of maneuvers, they've got to somehow consult with other people in advance. You've got a general sense that the U.S. is completely irresponsible because when they devalue the currency, they don't think of the international repercussions. They're only concerned with the domestic and, above all, domestic financial and domestic political. So instead of having a lynch mob against China, you in effect had a lynch mob against the U.S. Obama in bad shape at this meeting, not gaining anything. The big battle in the last phase was to get a criticism of China into the final communique. They wanted to have China, if not condemned, then at least criticized or somehow nicked for currency manipulation, or as it was then watered down to competitive devaluation. Competitive devaluation is a little bit harder to prove, but the U.S. couldn't get that. So the U.S. was completely rebuffed. The final communique does not contain the language that Obama was fighting for. Now, this reflects dramatic across-the-board weakness in the Obama political posture. Just to go into that for a minute, look at the debacle of the last week. The failure at the G20 meeting to orchestrate a front against China, the failure to head off an anti-U.S. front, which has de facto emerged. Now, there's also on top of that, free trade. Obama's devotion to free trade. This is one of the most monstrous features of this regime. You may remember the Ohio-Pennsylvania primary. Remember that when Hillary Clinton began making noises that she was not so keen on free trade, that maybe it was time to review NAFTA and a few other free trade sellouts, right, to try to attenuate the giant sucking sound, which has been sucking U.S. jobs overseas with this free trade competition from sweatshop labor around the world. Well, you'll remember that Obama had to imitate those noises against free trade, but he sent Austin Goolsbee. You'll remember Austin Goolsbee, now the head of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Austin the Goolsbee of Skull and Bones and a kind of a backdoor member of the Chicago School of Monetarism. Goolsbee went to the Canadian consul and assured him, look, don't worry about this. This is just noise. This is just stuff that we're telling the Mickeys for election purposes. So the rising tide of anti-protectionism needs to go much further. But Obama didn't even get his deal. His attempted free trade sellout to the Republic of Korea failed because of objections from the Republic of Korea side. South Korea not happy with the concessions that Obama was offering. So the G20 is a failure. The visit to South Korea is a failure. And then if we look at Iraq, even in this militarized puppet state created by the U.S. is unable to impose its puppet Alawi. Maliki is now going to lead the next government. So 3 big defeats as U.S. influence around the world collapses, even as Obama craters here at home. Back in a minute.